Hey, Acid Horizon listeners, this is Craig. I just wanted to say thank you to everybody who recently subscribed to our Patreon account. We had an exciting time meeting everybody for our first two sessions of the reading of the Rhizome Plateau in Deleuze and Guattari's A Thousand Plateaus. If you're looking for a way to engage with this material in a comfortable peer group that meets once a month and has a little bit of a flexible schedule, definitely sign up. It only takes $1 on our Patreon account. Also, doing so is going to give you access to incidental seminars like the one that we're going to have with Jason Reed. That is going to happen on Friday, February 11th at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 8 p.m. GMT. And the recording will be available on our Patreon account. We're going to be talking about his new book on the production of subjectivity. And particularly, we're going to look at the way that he's used the work of Deleuze and Guattari in his new work. It's very easy to get in on all of this. All you have to do is find the link below to our Patreon account, click, and subscribe. Today's episode involves recapping some of the discussions that happened in our first seminar on the Rhizome Plateau. We invited one of the readers in to speak with us who had some interesting things to say during those first two sessions. So let's welcome Sam and get on with the show. Welcome to Acid Horizon, the Theory Podcast. Today's episode is entitled Rhizome Wrap-Up. What we're going to do today is revisit some of the discussions, some of the themes that we encountered in our recent A Thousand Plateaus reading group. We talked about the first plateau, introduction, rhizome, and we covered many of the concepts in that plateau. And today we wanted to revisit some of these concepts and do so with some guests of the reading group, of which one has appeared today, and that is Sam. Welcome, Sam.
Hi. Yeah, it's just me, I guess.
And Sam brought up some interesting points related to music in our session of the reading group, and I was hoping that we would go back into that a little bit today. But perhaps one of the first things that we can do is talk about the rhizome. Let's just get a sort of general introduction, or what were some of the general questions that were still looming. And maybe I'll just ask Sam. Sam, what was something that you got from the reading group? Was this your first time encountering this text? Where are you at with the concept of the rhizome? What is it doing for you? Maybe you can just answer one of those questions to start.
Yeah, that's a lot of questions, sure. But it wasn't my first time reading A Thousand Plateaus. I've gone through a few excerpts and just once the whole book, which is never a good thing with D&G. You have to reread it 1,000 times, I guess. But I think it's very, for example, I'll give you this one, this thing I had in the back of my mind all the time. Whenever I've read most philosophy, let's say German idealism, like Kant, Hegel, whatever, I don't always think, how am I going to apply this in real life? I don't always think of examples of any particular concept. Mm-hmm. But when I read, let's say, anything in Capitalism and Schizophrenia, the application of these things is always lingering in my mind. How would this go about? How would I create, music is a good example. How would I engage with people politically, socially? It's always in the back of my mind when reading these texts. And with regard to the rhizome, it was a very particularly difficult topic, I think, for me. I think it's mostly because of the way they write, or maybe it's all the French people who write that. I don't know, but it's one of those things for sure. So I think, do you want me to tell you what I know about it or something?
Yeah, sure. Take a pass at it. If someone were to approach you on the street and grab the lapel of your jacket and say, "Hey man, what's a rhizome?"
As far as my understanding goes, and I haven't been able to engage with this in a philosophy peer group of sorts. So again, it's just been me in my room reading stuff. So sometimes I could get things wrong, especially with convoluted theory, So I think the rhizome, it stands in contrast with a kind of logic that is rigid. For example, they call it an arborescent way of thinking, right? And an example of this would be a tree, literally. So a tree has roots that are deeply ingrained underneath the ground, and from it a tree sprouts up. And there's a central system to this whole structure, so to speak. There's the roots, and it's centralized. It's not, there are branches that form out in these sort of patterns and these sort of bifurcatory patterns, even like when you see on some branches. And a rhizomatic way of thinking would be it doesn't lead back to this like the primordial root, so to speak, like that base root. It doesn't lead back to it at all. So it's fundamentally, it's like multi-centered in a way. It's non-linear and it's extremely heterogeneous, as opposed to the homogeneity of a tree. So this allows for thinking about things always in relation to each other, not just as, let's say, man, woman, and like male, female, left, right. It's never just this. There's so many connective, non-linear patterns that you can grab out of this way of thinking. So I guess that will be my understanding, like if that's sufficient enough.
No, that's great. In fact, we can close the episode now. That was a fantastic explication of the rhizome. But I feel like Adam is called out a little bit here because you brought up German idealism and its lack of usefulness. So, Adam, take it away.
Well, I mean, see, when it comes to the competition between German idealism and Deleuzeism, when it comes to trees, rhizomes, those sort of structures, I don't think it's particularly good to put them in competition in this way, because we might end up reifying a kind of binary when Deleuze and Guattari say tree good, roots bad. But what they are tackling in sort of making trees, that sort of top-down vertical structure, problematic, it's a particular kind of way that very goes to the heart of German idealism, particularly its origins in Kant, about transcendental structures, which means that there is a presupposed unity that determines everything. I mean, for Kant, for example, in the B deduction, he says that, that the transcendental unity of apperception, the I think, this unity, this self-identical I, is the structure, the site of all experience, and the root that legitimates why we can apply certain categories, certain meanings, certain judgments to the objects of experience. And to branch out in the many ways in which this text has multiple applications. If you read as well the Machinic Unconscious by Felix Guattari, as translated by a friend of the show, Taylor Adkins, their main attack point, or the main reference point to where they get this idea of the tree from, is Chomskyan computational linguistics. So in computational linguistics, it's essentially a diagrammatic way of deriving the meaning of a sentence, taking a sentence, breaking it into its constitutive parts, and then showing what that sentence means. So when I was doing it back at undergrad, I mean, what we'd have to do is you'd have to have the sentence, that snow is white, say, and then you break up different components, snow is, and then white, and it branches out in this binary sense now. We've gone from snow is white to snow is, one branch, white's the other branch. Then you keep deriving and splitting these words and these portions of a sentence in order to discern their meaning. And then you can go up and down. You've got the roots, the components, and you have the overall meaning of the sentence. But those components only make sense in light of the unity of the sentence. And this sentence only has one meaning, which you have derived and which you can work back, up and down from. And this is the one. This is the unity, the oneness. And to move this from linguistics to political, in this text, the rhizome is also an alternative model, or alternative way of approaching that sort of model, the model of connections, the model of distributing meanings and access that we get in some Maoist formulations. This is why Badiou was particularly offended by parts of this text. The old Maoist formulation, one divides into two. The sentence, snow is white. One sentence, unity sentence, divides into two parts, snow is, and then white. And and then those only make sense in relation to the one, which is the sentence, snow is white. So the rhizome, in describing it so far, we've already got two different senses in which it's applicable. The political sense of the dialectical one divides into two, and in any interpretation of dialectics that would focus itself on that, Deleuze and Guattari would be wholly opposed, especially in the German idealist context. So, I mean, I don't think they're entirely right. I think German idealism, particularly certain later French readings of Hegel, for example, from Malibu, and even to some extent with Zizek, place Deleuze and Guattari in the rhizome on a slightly similar terrain, but we'll have to get into that later. But I've only really described the rhizome negatively in terms of what it's going against. I'm wondering if anyone can come in and tell me a bit more about the positive content of a bit more building on what Sam's put forward so far. I mean, I know, Matt, you're a resident academia stamp scholar of Deleuze and Guattari. Go on, you want to.
I wouldn't go quite that far, but I think a lot of it's been covered already. One of the only things I wanted to add so far, at least as far as we're just trying to give an account of what the rhizome is, and this is something I said in a reading group, but I'll repeat it here because not everyone listening will have been there. There's an easy misreading of what Deleuze and Guattari are saying here, and that misreading says something like, rhizomes are basically good because they're non-hierarchical, non-structured, etc. Whereas trees are hierarchical. There's a sort of root and all the rest of it, and this is a sort of model for authoritarianism, and that's bad. Deleuze and Guattari aren't quite saying that. They're not saying that rhizomes are good and that trees are bad or arborescence is bad. The point is instead to try and understand that any given assemblage, and that's the unifying concept, as Deleuze calls it, for the entire book, the assemblage. Any given assemblage is going to display tendencies and a certain ratio towards either of these kinds of structures, right? The obvious example for them later in the book of a deeply arborescent structure would be the state, for example. But it's not simply the model of arborescence. It will also display more or less tendencies towards a kind of flatness or openness and so on as well. You would need to analyze it concretely to see that. So what Brent Adkins calls this is a perceptual semiotics. What they're trying to do with this idea of rhizome, at least on his reading, is to help us firstly see things in a new way, and that having seen them in a new way, we can understand better all these different complex assemblages that we are always part of and involved in. And one last thing I was going to say there as well was that it's probably because I've been reading lots of Frédéric Lordon recently. I've been thinking about this idea of a regulative ideal, because this seems to reappear over and over again in Deleuze and Guattari's work, the idea of a kind of a limit experience, of breaking through of the limits. And that can be a really positive thing in some cases, but it's also extremely dangerous. In Anti-Oedipus, their example of a certain endpoint of that quote unquote schizophrenic process is that it just collapses into what we call the full body, or the catatonic body, in which there's simply no organization at all anymore. And that's not sustainable. I think there's a section in this introduction where they say something along the lines of, we've had enough of trees, we need more rhizomes, right? And I think that would be true. They certainly think that we've tended in all sorts of areas, philosophy, linguistics, arts, and so on, to focus far too much on a particular way of thinking about the world and about that discipline, and that they would like us to go much further in the direction of this rhizomatic model. It's always a ratio of one towards the other, because rhizomes and following these lines of flight can always lead into black holes, as they call it, right? So that's the last thing I wanted to add, is that it's not a simple binary between rhizomes and arborescents, and trees. Neither of them have a sort of concrete moral value in and of themselves. They're ways of seeing things and understanding their tendencies and their characters, I suppose.
Will, did you want to hop in with your best of rhizome reading?
I do, but I want to try to, and maybe it's because I've had too much of academic Deleuzianism. I want to reinsert the political stakes and intensity here, and just talk about like the most vulgar elements of this text in a kind of nonchalant way. And I want to focus on this notion of neighborness as a point in a rhizomatic structure versus in an arborescent structure. That any given point in a rhizomatic structure is not going to have the same relationship to other conceptual elements in that structure as in an arborescent one, right? In an arborescent structure, one's neighbor is only in relation to a hierarchical determination, right? So they find this really when they, in the postulates of linguistics, Plateau, when they finally just pretty much outright state that there are elements of Chomskyan linguistics that are just blatantly racist, right? So this idea, there is no mother tongue. It's this ability to take a look at this form of linguistics and to explode it, to show that it is part of a long history of hierarchical thinking, both in our understanding of whether it be sovereignty or metaphysics, right? And those two things inform one another, of course. But like for me, what this comes down to is the possibility of opening up for a political multiplicity. And what this allows us to do is to understand that through this model, we can form entirely new connections, right? That are not already bound to the remarkably pre-discursive elements that the rhizomatic structure lends itself to. So it allows for new experiences to come into the fold of subjectivation. It's always about these totalizing, overcoding processes. So that's why they love, let's say back in Anti-Oedipus, they do kind of love the notion of the partial object. But it's lost the second that the analysand is pushed to say, and it's because I wasn't held enough as a child. Or it's because in the eyes of my father, I could never step into his leather shoes. For Deleuze and Guattari, it is always about charting paths, about the philosophy of experience rather than a philosophical process of tracing that can then define experience with a sort of juridical, judgmental power. That's the difference between the rhizomatic structure and the arborescent structure. Is it's comparable to the difference between the tracing and the map, between overcoding and a diagrammatic, between overcoding and cartography, frankly.
Yeah, that's one of the other concepts that we didn't really break into in the reading group that I wanted to unpack a little bit here, is this difference between a map and a tracing, and what they call the principle of cartography or decalcomania. And I remember the first time I saw this, that was a word that I had to look up. It's an artistic method of like layering paint or prints onto like ceramics or something like that. Maybe I have that somewhat wrong, but that's my understanding of it. But Matt, I know you wanted to talk about that in the reading group when we were wrapping things up. Did you want to say a few words about that?
Yeah, I could just jump in a little bit there. I really love it. Will brought up the point about cartography and decalcomania, because it's another example of where Deleuze and Guattari are not simply drawing a binary, where one is good and one is bad. There's this section in the plateau, not plateau really, the rhizome, where they write that there exist tree or root structures in rhizomes. Conversely, a tree branch or root division may begin to burgeon into a rhizome. And that's really important, right? It's all a matter of how we understand the thing that we're looking at, whether that's a political configuration or a piece of art or an artistic movement, so on and so forth, right? But this idea of cartography, I think, is a really helpful way of thinking about one of the key characteristics of a rhizome, or a rhizomatic way of thought, etc. of being. And Brent Atkins actually has a really, I think, a fun little way of explaining this. So decalcomania obviously has to do with which we think of decals, right? So stickers. I'll just quote this. I think it's a really helpful way of understanding it. He writes, "When my kids were younger, they loved to play with stickers. They still have quite a few in the back of the closet somewhere. They much prefer drawing their own pictures to stickers now, though. The reason for this is that while stickers are great and we produce exactly what you want on the page, they're also limiting. If I want a stegosaurus, but all my stickers are of Dimetrodons, then I have to make a picture with Dimetrodons or learn how to draw one. Deleuze and Guattari think that the dominant tendency in philosophy has been to use stickers instead of drawing. They're safe, they don't risk anything, but they keep reproducing the same image of thought over and over again. But conversely, what he says later is, well, in the context of his kids playing with stickers, well, if they wanted a dragon, perhaps we could use a dinosaur sticker and then just draw flames coming out of its mouth, right? So his example there goes back to the same one they're talking about in from passage I just quoted in A Thousand Plateaus, right? Which is that it's not simply a matter of opposing the rhizome to the arborescent model, because that can be useful. You can use, for example, old concepts in creative and interesting ways in some cases, but they think there's this overwhelming tendency towards endlessly doing this, just using the same concepts, ideas, and images of thought over and over again. And the concern, of course, is that it eliminates the possibility of the new, right? How can you create anything new out of the endless repetition without difference of these old concepts, I suppose?
No, that's perfect. That puts us right where at least I want to be in this discussion, especially with respect to music, because I remember when we were having the reading group, Sam had mentioned that one of the challenges to writing music was overcoming these kind of forms or patterns, if you will, that typifies the kind of music that we listen to wherever we're listening to music, right? So here in the United States, for years and years, it was the intro, verse, chorus, bridge, outro, chorus. And that sort of creative habit looms over many artists who are trying to make a hit song or something that's popular, for example. And one of the reasons for that is that structure, or that decal, organizes the creative intensities in such a way that's exciting. And it's familiar, and it sells products. And this is one of the primary problems that stands in the way of creating something new musically. And I know this is something that you, Sam, had brought up in the reading group, so maybe you can flesh out your concerns about that a little bit right now.
Yeah, for me, I found it kind of hard when I was trying to blend different genres. And it becomes even more complex when you're trying to blend, let's say, what people would consider Western music with like, Indian or like the Eastern kind of style. Because I like Hindustani ragas, if you've heard of them. Mm-hmm. They're like very melodic and just like perfect. So I've always been like, shoegaze is another one of my favorite genres. Mm-hmm. So like, what happens if I could, just like boom, blend these two? And it feels like, I don't know how to, but I think someone from the reading group was able to put this properly, that it was in the back of my head that I was mimicking everything from typical shoegaze and typical raga, when that's not supposed to be happening. It's supposed to be like a genuine outburst of something new. But to me, it always felt like I was just crudely mashing things in together. And I don't know how to explain this. Do you get what I'm saying?
Well, one of the things that they say in the text is that you can have a rhizome emerge from the intersection of two arborescences. When you started talking about that, I don't think I mentioned it in the reading group at the time, but to me, that seemed to resonate pretty closely with what they were saying in the text. Sometimes we can pull in genre A and genre B and collide them. I mean, it's not so hard these days, for example, to take, this is essentially the origins of hip hop music, right? Take an old funk track, flip it, pull out the drum break, put it on top. And then what was drum and bass? All right, let's just speed that up. Okay, now let's just put jazz chords there instead of this old funk track, And so there was, a few ways to do this. But I think what happens is sometimes once you set up the collision course, it sets up a different kind of discovery. At least that's happened to me upon occasion in creating certain tunes. I go in with a certain intention. Okay, I'm going to take some funk here. All right, and let's try this sort of mathy metal, and then let's see what comes out of it. And then maybe that's not what I come up with at all, right? Maybe I hear something in the phrasing, for example, or in the tonality of the tune altogether that makes me scrap the whole thing and say, all right, fuck it. I'm just going to do this drum beat with that guitar tone now. And now I have something completely different. So it's like I'm shot out of the collision of those two arborescences into this new thing.
Yeah, I just wanted to use this musical framing to explore some of the terms that I think need a bit more of a clear definition, particularly in relation to cartography. Let's say that music is a map of different kinds of sounds, different kinds of arrangements of sounds. We talk about mixing two genres such as ragas and shoegaze, then both of them have a proper name. There's both an assigned meaning. There's both a genre here. If you want to put in a Chomskyan linguistics tree, you could have shoegaze here, and then you can do a bifurcation of the meaning of shoegaze. You can have raga here, and have a bifurcation of the meaning of the ragas. I guess it's what I say, because at least in my experience, ragas are typically more like scales that you can repeat in much more differential kinds of ways. At least the times I've tried to play it. I mean, I used to own an old sitar, but I never really got properly acquainted with it. But in taking a genre of music, what we're doing is that we're taking a copy of a particular region of the map of all kinds of sounds. And we're overcoding that. So in overcoding in the sense that there's too much coding, over doesn't mean too much, but we are in tracing, we are selecting a region of the realm of music, the realm of sounds. And we're overcoding it in the sense of giving it a unified sense. We're drawing the boundaries over this part of the map, and we're saying this is the land of shoegaze. This is the land of how to play certain ragas, for example. This is the land of saying ragas. There's certain kinds of vocal phrases you could say that would denote what drum beats meant what. And this overcoding is fixing unified meaning onto certain kinds of rhythms, certain kinds of patterns. And music is a great way of explaining these notions of mapping, tracing. You take the math music, you trace a region of that, you take a little snippet of that, and you've got a genre. and this genre is a unified genre, has X, Y, Z characteristics, and in that sense, we have the sentence that X is shoegaze, Y is a proper performance of a raga. And I think the idea of mixing, I think some of the tension, that comes with mixing genres, Sam, you're completely right. It's trying to force these sentences, which are so overcoded, so unified, and saying this is what is in this genre, this is what is in this genre, and they can clash, they can contradict. But you can draw this flame over the sticker of each, and produce something new to it. And I think even with my own work in sort of noise and jungle, it's a very sticker-like genre in the sense that it's all built out of the main beat. Essentially, it's the amen break. But we can draw all kinds of things around it. We can make amen breaks out of other samples. We can make amen breaks out of different genres that aren't particularly used in jungle, and we can force these two trees, we can bring these sentences together, we can push them together to the point at which their boundaries, their regions start to rupture, and then there is something new there is a new thing established in this rhizomatic manner, and we can select it and say this is a new genre, and that would have to be our choice to make that new sentence, to overcode in that particular manner. I mean, you can even see that with some of the ways in which indie music and sort of Western metal have come together. For example, I think of a band like Bloodywood. They put together the elements of Bhangra with metal, and sort of forcing these two sentences together, something new has arisen from this, bringing both of their points into a conversation through rupturing their traditional bout, from breaking down the fences of these two regions of music and forming a new one in their particular sound.
And from the experiential standpoint, I like to think of overcoding as a kind of necessity or impulse to report back to the genres in the midst of your creative activity, in the sense that, sometimes you will be, especially if you're wedded to a particular genre, if you're a metal artist or a punk artist, for example, if one deviates too far from that, there's the risk of, well, is this going to land well on the ear of the fans? Is this going too far from who we are? That sort of thing. So it entails all kinds of risks. And I think part of slipping out of the unity of any genre and producing music with a sort of rhizomatic awareness involves just figuring out how to situate the genres. This is clearly an example of where it's an N-1, where the unities or the totalities fall back into the map, right? They're not overcoding the map, but they're adjacent to the creative activity.
Did Adam say something about Bhangra and metal? Like, wow, really?
Yeah, I'll send it over. It's really, really good.
That is insane. Like, I've never heard of something like that, but yeah.
Yeah, this elementary rhythm, it's obviously, they're actually rhythm, this fundamental rhythmic structure of Bhangra with the more traditional singing, and there's this metal aspect coming onto it, because it is a beautiful example of the rhizomatics of music here, forcing two trees together, bringing each to their point of rupture, and it's, do you think that sort of idea of the map and the tracing, do you think that sort of resonates with your sort of experience trying to push together genres like using raga forms with shoegaze?
Perhaps, yes. For me, like, honestly, it's kind of, because I'm not actively doing this right now. This was like about a half year ago or something. And like now I'm like ton of work. So I just like quit music for a while, I guess. But I think what you were saying made sense. And I was also about to ask about that Bhangra metal thing. Like, I would assume like the percussive part of it would be very distinct, I think, right?
Yeah. The percussive part is very distinct. And also, in a sense, it doesn't it's not swapped out for the traditional metal drum, so to speak. There is still a drummer. There's actually two or three drummers. It is they are allowed to intermingle, and in the rhythm of any one of these songs, the rhythm of the metal drums and the rhythm of the doll drums, you can jump from one point. You can jump from one point in that rhythm to any other part of the rhythmic stuff in that section. So I think it's a really fantastic way of sort of explaining it, at least in my opinion. And Bloodywood are great anyway. That
makes sense. And you mentioned something about overcoding. Like, I think that's another concept I found kind of hard to understand. For me, I think overcoding, I always viewed it like as a layer that you put on top of a rhizomatic structure to make it more, how do you say, congruent, like for the lack of a better term, like unified.
No, yeah, that is the unity. It is like this. It is this layer you put over it to say it's like a fence you put over or a net. You capture this realm of intensities, and you say, okay, this is what this part means. There could be loads of meanings here, but this is what this part means now. There's a force of putting things over and saying this is this one meaning and it applies to this thing. It becomes the sentence at the top of the tree which defines all the other little parts.
And I think Craig was saying something about like this fear that artists have, like if I stray too much away from the norm, will people think it's crazy? And I think actually it is true in certain cases. People are just very used to highly structured, normalized, say, metal. It's always it has the structure, or shoegaze, or like black gaze, or anything. For example, do you guys know this band, Lady Discrets? I think it's French, but initially they were doing kind of like black gazy atmospheric metal, and everyone's like, oh shit, so cool. And then they kind of just like laid back and tried some experimental electronic stuff, and everyone's like, oh shit, this sucks so much. Like nobody's ready for something like that, you know? So I guess this fear is always there in musicians, dancers, like anyone in the arts, I guess.
We can all remember the rhizomatic joy that happened when Death Heaven Sunbather came out. I mean, you mentioned yourself, Sam, black gaze, black metal and shoegaze. Black metal and shoegaze literally brought to each other's mutual points of rupture, and the new realm on the territory of music was formed. Just a remark on the events that was that album.
I mean, I always thought Alcest was like were the pioneers of black gaze, or not just like,
yeah.
Maybe it's Alcest and Death Heaven, both of them.
They discovered the territory, but Death Heaven mapped it. Like.
I think we need to hear from Rhizomatic right now. Will, are there any rhizomatic tendencies in emo music?
Yeah, absolutely. But what I was going to say was actually, does anyone find it? I always find it hilarious because like emo has this historical problem where bands tried desperately to escape kind of the monotony of the second wave of emo. And what they often find themselves doing is producing the most cliched versions of pop rock imaginable, right? Because they don't understand the dangers of the canvas that they're being handed, right? So one of Deleuze's great concerns in his cinema books, in his book on Francis Bacon, is cliche, right? So what I find is so funny about oftentimes when bands leave these spaces, and of course, there have been some really great projects that mix tendencies in emo and shoegaze, right? So Pity Sex being one of those projects. And those that mix kind of lo-fi, jazzy elements. But it's always through sort of a process of apprenticeship or of a dwelling in those genre spaces that allow for these sorts of points of connection to be made where sorts of compatibilities start to come through and new intensities can be formed. But what I find so interesting is that, you know, when we say, oh, like what I want to do is I want to combine this and that, and through that combination, a new thing will be born. But sometimes I think it takes a really deep and particular understanding of each of the respective movements you're looking at to actually produce this third term or fourth term, fifth term, because the reality is like, what's worse than a bad synthesis paper? What if I just wrote about Nietzsche and Deleuze? Well, you know, you can, but it will largely just be the equivalence of Leonardo DiCaprio pointing at the screen and saying, aha, you know, I see a point of convergence here. But instead you have to understand the intensities and various metaphysical movements that are happening here and create kind of queered alliances that can come through, and to create it is to engage in that form of buggery that Deleuze talks about, this ability to give birth to a monstrosity that nonetheless can still claim, you know, membership to this thing, right? That's the goal of his sort of method of whether it be bricolage or what else.
Yeah, I think in some sense we should be thankful or excited about there being so many cliches on the canvas.
Right.
Because an apt eye will be able to determine points of entry relative to certain impulses that they might have.
That's a great point. Yeah.
One of the problems is, one of the other risks or challenges is that we're talking about here is flying so far off the grid or having no modicum of regulative principles to maintain an experiment.
And that's why so many of those bands, when they fall out and they say, let's play with disco, they end up just replicating the cheapest, most uninspired form of the calcification of the genre they're toying with. Right? Like, you can't distinguish between, and it pains me to say this, some of the poppier elements of the Taking Back Sunday catalog from like the worst parts of American pop rock in the mid 2000s, because they fell so far out of it that they couldn't help but so quickly be captured by the old cliches and fall right back into what is just uninspiring.
Can we agree Def Heaven, like any changes they've made to their style, they've kind of nailed it, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, they've gone just full jangly shoegaze.
Yeah, like Infinite
now,
Granite was like kind of different, but I loved Infinite Granite.
They have concretized their new rise. They've mapped up their, I mean, they're still on a line of flight. I mean, obviously there are some lines of flight you can take where everything gets a bit too much for some people. I mean, we say something like Captain Beefheart was on a line of flight, or if you get into sort of the catatonia of someone like John Cage's 433, which is just silence, or eventually you could follow the line of flight that was drone music, let's say, someone like Sun. And I think they're still developing on it, but there's definitely a sense of the drone can be its own sort of hierarchy, and it can be its own kind of worship. I mean, they call it worshipping the amp. And it's just a matter of getting these key elements and keeping on pushing them further. But we can go too far with a rhizome, and it's not always necessarily emancipatory, is it? Because there's always that sort of aspect of never having any consistency or never having any. It's not that unity is bad for them. It's that we need to be open to finding points where we can bring certain elements to rupture away from these unities and then open up possibilities of the new. And even in the political sense, I just wanted to bring this up and it will reflect on music as well. Actually, I'll start from the music and then I'll move in to the political. So let's talk about black metal. Black metal was in itself a kind of rupturing in the second wave in Norway, really, between sort of this getting out of the sort of the death metal mode, in particularly synthesizing these very dark, sometimes quite ambient parts of very sort of speedy punk stuff like Venom, and then the avant-garde elements of Celtic Frost and the somewhat choral elements, but also very speed rocky elements or speed metal-y elements of Bathory. And it was the construction of a new scene. However, in the construction of this new sort of breaking together of old meanings and producing a new meaning in this new genre, they mapped out their territory in music. Then the notable people in the Norwegian scene built a fence around and said, no, this is the new hierarchy. These are the new codes. This is the new unities, what we do. This is what the Black Circle is exemplified in people like Euronymous and someone who I'm not even going to bother naming. And you can see that when it came to like Euronymous and the early black metal scene, it was about him. He controlled the access and the inclusion in this genre. He was a sort of declarative point of who was part of this genre or not. And he controlled the channels of the record labels and the meeting spots in terms of the record store. And that allowed him to control one channel on this new rhizomatic structure that all of them had to depend upon for their legitimacy as members of this new confluence of intensities. And then we enter into what Carl Wittfolger was talking about and what Deleuze and Guattari draw on in talking about a hydraulic despotism, how a rhizome goes wrong. Basically, you can form new tree structures, and even if you don't form a new tree structure, a hydraulic just isn't necessarily a tree structure. It's that there are certain paths, certain connections that all the others end up relying upon, end up converging upon. And if you control access to those key channels, then you can essentially, even from a multiplicitous set of connections of nodes, you can control how different things get in and out of those nodes from a point that isn't necessarily above or below them, but simply another point on the network. I mean, to think about the way I always like to explain it is through books that the Guattari himself knew quite well, which was the Dune series. Everything relies upon the working of spice. this thing that allows people to do space travel by allowing them to pilot things, keeps people alive, and is an addictive source for religious rituals and political espionage. And it only grows on one planet. So even though the universe is this grand multiplicity, and this place at the time isn't an imperial capital by the first book, there's this one node all the other nodes rely upon. So who controls the spice, the node that the spice comes from, this particular intensity that everything converges upon, whoever controls that controls the universe and every other point on multiplicitous network of the universe in that series. And I think that's where rhizomes can bring new forms of despotism aren't necessarily hierarchical. It's not necessarily that the spice is, ordained, sentenced to be a god or an artifact in itself, but it controls so many functions in how meaning is sustained and created across a whole network of different practices and connections that becomes the thing that if you control it, you become the dictator of that meaning. Not simply by imposing a new meaning of it, but by having control of the very pathways that meaning has any way to flow towards. And then, of course, you can that's both music and the political.
I just wanted to jump in because I've got two short things to say. One is I wanted to say something because Adam was talking earlier about overcoding, and that's a really useful concept, but some people might find it a little bit confusing because I think it's referenced or used 4 times in A Thousand Plateaus. And the reason for that is that it's a term that you get from anti-Oedipus, and which is transformed into the idea of territorialization, deterritorialization in A Thousand Plateaus. The reason being they want to kind of emphasize the spatiality of it and the physicality of it, that this is not just about sort of abstract cultural values, but also about our literal physical environment as well. So everything Adam said was fine and great. Just wanted to point out that, if you're reading Overcoding now and going through the Rhizome or this book, think in terms of the territorialization idea. Adam's been waiting for so long to talk about a Deleuze and Guattari reading of Dune, and that might have to wait for another episode. But
I've just done it.
Well, yes, that's the abridged version, though. I know you've got essays there. You've got essays. But one way of thinking about overcoding, though, is that I don't want to go into all the details of this, but you were talking about how everything needs to pass through Arrakis, right? Everything must pass through this. Perhaps, and maybe we'll become a cultural analysis.
Arrakis passes through everything. It's the opposite way around.
Right. Well, sort of. But you could read that as an example of what Deleuze and Guattari call the despotic signifier in Anti-Oedipus, which is a great example about being psychoanalysis in their view. Everything must pass through the single signifier of Oedipus and made to conform to it. And the second part about process on the larger scale is overcoding. That's what overcoding is. It's the imposition of a certain regime of signification on a given territory. And that's, so 2 things there. Firstly, that's why they developed this more explicitly in A Thousand Plateaus to emphasize that kind of geographical element, I suppose. And the last thing I was going to say on the idea of black metal becoming, starting off as something like a rupture and then sort of re-stratifying itself. This is exactly what Deleuze and Guattari say is always a risk, especially thinking rhizomatically. Passage only a few pages into a rhizome, where they say, it's why one can never posit a dualism or a dichotomy, even in a rudimentary form of the good and the bad. You may find a rupture, draw a line of flight, yet there is still a danger that you will re-encounter organizations that re-stratify everything. Formations that restore power to a signifier, attributions that reconstitute a subject. Anything you like, from Oedipal resurgences to fascist concretizations. Groups and individuals contain microphasms just waiting to crystallize. Yes, couchgrass is also a rhizome. Good and bad are only the products of an active and temporary selection, which must be renewed. That's the warning, right? You can, follow a line of flight, seek to escape from arborescent, thinking. But that has its own dangers, and there's no guarantee that it won't be even more destructive than what you started with, basically.
If you want to hear about us talking about how the re-territorialization of black metal into a particular fascist lens in some corners, check out our episode with Ben Noyes. We talk about his essay, Be True to the Earth, and that's entirely what this is about.
I like that we're talking a little bit more about overcoding here and the possibility of rupturing the apparatus of overcoding. With respect to music, I think there's one example I would say even an exemplar within the history of American music, which is John Cage's performance on a CBS TV show in 1960 called I've Got a Secret. And maybe you've seen it on YouTube. I'll pop it in the links. Maybe I'll even put the audio at the end of this episode if I don't get a copyright strike. But essentially what John Cage wanted to do was he wanted to set up an experimental music performance on stage, basically in a venue where you're seeing pop bands and things like that. And so what he's going to do now is introduce the whole of American primetime to the concept of experimental music by this assemblage of radios that he's going to turn off and on. And there was a whole struggle with not only with the network producers, but with the workers' unions and everything for him to be able to do this because it was so out of the ordinary. And I like to think that the performance aspect, this would be great. This would be like a great movie, by the way. The whole performance aspect actually begins at the level of deliberation, between him and the networks and so forth. When he finally gets to the stage and he's got like a bathtub or something up there and these radios and he's throwing radios around and making loud clangs and hitting little gongs and things like that, the audience erupts in laughter because really what it is, it's almost like a real-time parody of the primetime experience in a live performance. And a lot of people, like if you look at the YouTube comments on this particular video, people will say that the laughter of the audience itself was part of this performance. And so from beginning to end, from the inception of this project to negotiating with the network and struggling with the union and actually doing the performance, there were a series of ruptures that were involved that basically inaugurated the popularity of John Cage in a way that the world had not yet seen experimental music of this kind.
The thing for me is like, I want to know how this turns into a political ethics, right? What does this mean in the context of French militancy in the 70s and 80s? Like, what was part of the political context that Deleuze and Guattari were inheriting and grappling with? And why do we still have to grapple with it today? And the rhizome takes us in like so many different directions, right? One of them's already been shown to us by Adam with this idea of hydraulic despotism. And of course, we have our plethora of individuals who constitute nodes of new forms of micro-sovereignties, right? Foucault talks about this too. But, we have Palantir, we have, the crypto monarchists that we find in figures like Moldbug and Land and so on. And these are stultifying and horrific forms of thought. But what I think Deleuze and Guattari are trying to get us to do is there's this one sentence on the final page of the plateau. And, they love their exclamations, their broad assertions. But the one that keeps changing its meaning to me is this: don't bring out the general in you. It's like, don't necessarily run from organization, but do run from the vanguard. These moments of solidarity, of affinity, those are important and real. These connections that you build, but don't always immediately overcode them. Always be outrunning this process, because once the entirety of a particular plane is overcoded, it's lost. And for Deleuze and Guattari, this remains one of their problems, is that like these organizations and structures, whether they be particular state formations or like particular militant groups, they outstay their welcome and their use. For me, it will just come down to this positive conjunction of the productive aspect of affinities and connections. And I think that maybe that's kind of at the heart of a nomadic militantism. So maybe that's one place that we can touch on. The one area in this reading group that maybe we should close on as we come to an end is to sort of talk about the Nietzschean ethical implications here, because I know we closed with that in one of the meetings, but I don't think I ever got the answer, the entire answer that I was hoping to get from you about the elements of a Nietzschean ethics here. So like, what do you see as the connection between Deleuze and Guattari's work on Nietzsche and this, monumental plateau?
there's a couple ways to go here, but I think we've already somewhat covered it in overcoming the figure of overcoding to develop a kind of praxis, almost like a kill switch or an algorithm within our politics that is kind of a distant early warning for the emergence of that sort of thing. But one of the risks too is that our paranoia about that can be undermining as well. And sometimes our affinities can be so scattered that it will never develop enough, just like with experimental music, right?
Right.
If the affinities are just too, diffuse, scattered, whatever characteristic you want to imbue with their inability to be consistent enough to deal with the political task at hand, you're going to have a bad time. So I think that's the challenge is being able to acknowledge at some level a viable affirmation of affinity groups, of rhizomatic connections, of various solidarity groups, but at the same time be able to stave off that which seeks to impose kinds of value.
To calcify.
Yeah.
So active forgetting doesn't simply just become a mechanism through which we can engage in genealogy. In fact, Deleuze and Guattari are kind of tearing it out of Nietzsche and placing it into the ethico-political.
I haven't thought much about this, but just thinking about Nietzsche, there needs to be a way in which I think there's going to be a kind of ecstasis in the sense of, I don't want to say enjoyment, but there's going to be a sort of pleasure coupled with a kind of embodiment of suffering that's going to give the group its strength and cohesiveness, right? That goes beyond a mere acknowledgement or recognition of suffering in the other, right? Because I think that then we're on the road to ressentiment and that sort of thing, and beautiful soulism.
And what I think will be interesting is as we take the foundation that we find in this plateau, which Matthew kind of bore down on us and demanded that we start here, but we are taking it to the nomadology next.
Yeah.
So what are some things that we should all be looking for as we move forward in our little reading of this seminal, complicated, often nightmarish for graduate students, this text?
Oh, the state's coming at us hard. What can I say? I mean, we're going from the overcoding in the abstract sense to the state in the very real sense as an agent of overcoding. Sam, can we get some final thoughts from you? Where are you at with this discussion?
The black metal thing was very interesting. Especially, I think Adam mentioned some fascistic transformation of some black metal spaces. I always found that very interesting. Like, I find myself at odds with myself when I listen to like the only like NSBM band, Peste Noire. I think genuinely some of their albums have artistic merit, but like, dude, this guy like literally hates everyone who isn't white. So it's kind of weird. You mentioned that there was an episode where you guys went into this.
The Ben Noyes one is that the essay we was talking about was literally about Peste Noire.
Yeah. Oh, really? Okay, then I should definitely watch this. Okay. And another thing, I think, I remember in the last reading group, how I think it was Matt who stressed that rhizomes can be bad via capitalism as well. Like, because capitalism is not this rigid monolith of a thing that it used to be anymore, especially after the advent of the internet. I think it's much more insidious in like several ways. Yeah. I guess that would be like, if someone were to ask me, because I think earlier on, Matt also stressed that we shouldn't view rhizomes as like always good and like arborescent is always bad. I think a lot of people misread D&G like that. I guess capitalism would be an example. I want to bring that back into the conversation.
Yeah, the standard deterritorialization good argument.
Yeah, I've seen memes like that. It's like
leads only to the kinds of things that we all see on Twitter.
Before we go, I mean, Sam, we are just probably out of the loop when it comes to newer kinds of music that you're listening to in India. Are there any bands or are there any artists who are doing interesting things that sort of resonate with the topic here today?
Okay, here's the thing. I don't think I'm going to sound like so pessimistic. There isn't much interesting coming out of my country right now. I mean, it's the problem with a lot of Indian musicians is they're trying to emulate the West. Like completely, and in the process of doing so, they're like really ignoring everything that's beautiful about Hindustani music or Carnatic music that's like South India. So I don't really think there's much. I listen to old Carnatic artists like Amir Khan, Kumar Gandharva. All these people are like really good, and I listen to like shoegaze artists from the West and black metal, a lot of metal. So that's pretty much it.